How did Ontario become FordNation? Canada's most populous province saw a big blue steamroller plow over the opposition to a commanding 76 seats in Queen's Park and all but decimating Ontario's grits. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe for Unpublished Ottawa. I'm Ed Hand. I think it's safe to say the Ontario PCs won the election despite themselves. Just think. In January, then PC leader Patrick Brown bounced out of his spot after accusations surfaced involving young women. None of those complaints have gone before the courts. But that prompted a snap leadership race, which was acrimonious. Even when it came down to tabulating the leadership ballots, Christine Elliott was digging in against the numbers. In the end, though, it was Doug Ford who snatched the crown. And to add to the weight were messy nomination races and the fracturing of PC support to new parties who felt abandoned, like the Ontario Alliance, the Trillium Party, even the None of the Above Party. The Whirlwind campaign saw plenty of theatrics, and as voting day loomed, the province polarized to two sides. Think about it. With the NDP eating the Liberals' lunch, Premier Kathleen Wynne conceded she had no chance to win. It was a Hail Mary pass to try and stop Ford, and it turned into an interception. The PCs ran back for a majority government. Doug Ford was seen as the most toxic of choices when it came to the Ontario PC leadership race, but he prevailed. His provincial disapproval rating was almost as high as Kathleen Wynne's, yet he prevailed. How did it happen? What does it tell us about Ontarians? Ian Holliday is a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute, which followed the election closely, and he joins us now. And Ian, it appeared there were plenty of things working against the PCs. How did Ontario become FordNation?
Well, it's still sort of an open question, isn't it? And that's the thing that we do at the end of every election, particularly ones that have such a sort of strong narrative to them as this one did, is you look at what happened and you try to pick up the pieces and put everything together and figure out what really went on. We did do some polling during the election that found a lot of things working against Doug Ford, as you mentioned, but there were a lot of things working against the other candidates as well. And I think what ended up carrying the day, or one of the things that may have ended up carrying the day for the PCs, was that there were enough people who were willing to sort of, even if they were not hardcore members of FordNation, were willing to turn in Ford's direction rather than risk the possibility of a repeat of Bob Rae's NDP government, because from their perspective, that was the better choice. Now, whether all of your listeners would agree with that assessment is certainly up for debate. I imagine many of them would disagree vehemently. But as it ended up, those folks were outnumbered by the folks who were willing to vote for Doug Ford and the PCs, either enthusiastically or less than enthusiastically.
You know, it seemed the NDP had room to grow and the PCs didn't. What happened to their vote?
Well, turnout is always a key factor in an election. We know that this is something that's not just true in Canada, but across North America and indeed across the world. We tend to see older people are more likely to be conservative by and large, and they're also more likely to vote. And so the potential advantage for a left of center party like the NDP often comes into play in a high turnout election when they can get a really inspiring or motivating candidate, either a candidate in a local race or candidate at the top of the ballot in Andrea Horwath. Certainly the election of Barack Obama in the United States is a sort of quintessential example of this phenomenon, where he developed momentum in an environment that was fairly hostile toward the incumbent Republican Party anyway, and became this sort of inspiring figure that rallied the youth vote and rose turnout levels significantly and carried him to a significant victory in 2008. In Ontario this time around, we saw a higher turnout rate than we did in the previous election in 2014, but not the level of support that really comes with a big sort of progressive wave typically.
Was the NDP really ever in a position to win. And I say that because we look at Andrea Horwath, and your numbers show that she was the most accepted of the three leaders. Not that everybody had a great turnout. I'm wondering, in terms of the NDP, despite the solid result, is Andrea Horwath on a short leash?
It's certainly something that remains to be seen. This is not her first rodeo, so to speak. This is the third election that she's led the NDP in, and while she's gained seats in each of those, she hasn't been able to break through. And this really feels like the time that, if it was going to happen for her, it would have. She was, as you mentioned, much more favorably viewed by the Ontario electorate than Doug Ford or Kathleen Wynne. And it just didn't work out. So certainly the possibility that the membership of the New Democrats there in Ontario would look at that and say, is it time to go in a different direction?
Ian Holliday is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe, a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute, as we look back at the Ontario election. And from your perspective, what is in store for the Liberals and their 7 seats?
Well, I mean, I like to imagine that, I know that in politics we often talk about there's never a pure or altruistic motivation, but I like to sometimes imagine that there might be one. Not everything has to be strategy. Certainly, Kathleen Wynne's decision to concede the election before it was even, before ballots had even been cast, is a political play that you can analyze through political lenses. But I also felt like I detected a tone of relief in her voice as she was making this concession and saying, that whoever Ontarians pick for their new premier, it's not going to be me, and I'm okay with that. I like to think that was Kathleen Wynne turning the page, not only personally, but also for the Ontario Liberal Party. And now in opposition with only 7 seats, without the label of official opposition, there is room for the party to find itself again and mount a vigorous campaign to try to get back into power in Queen's Park, whether it's in the next election or another one down the road.
The Green Party gets its first win and will send an MPP to Queen's Park. How much was the Angus Reid Institute keeping tabs on the Greens, and what's this mean for the movement?
Well, it's certainly a positive sign for the movement. There has been a sense that at the federal level, the Greens have been a bit stalled lately. But what we've seen in the last couple of provincial elections now, Ontario, and before that in BC, is some breakthroughs that are going to bring some new blood into the Green Party, not just in the provinces where those new MLAs have been elected, but hopefully, at least from a Green perspective, into the federal scene as well. Elizabeth May has, I think, in the eyes of most Green Party supporters, done an excellent job in her role, but she's been quite lonely over the years. And that, I think, will be the next target for the Greens going forward is, can we build on this momentum that we've developed at the provincial level, even as our federal vote share has been stalled or even declining? Can we turn the support for local candidates and local leaders like Mike Schreiner and turn that into more momentum for electing another MP at the federal level and potentially finding a successor to Elizabeth May as the leader of the federal Greens?
Voter turnout was the highest since 1999. From your perspective, is that a sign people desperately wanted change or they were engaged in this election?
I think turnout is usually a reflection of engagement and of change. This was absolutely a change election. That was the one thing that all of the voters that we surveyed could agree upon, it seemed, was it's time for a change. Now, they ultimately chose, they were divided as to who they wanted to deliver that change, and they ultimately chose Doug Ford. But I think the idea that, a party that has been in power for 15 years, as the Liberals had, needs to be on its way out, and it's time to get rid of them, can be a very strong motivating factor for people.
Ian, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Ian Holliday is a research associate with the Angus Reid Institute with his perspective on the Ontario election campaign. The Ontario election brings us a new government that's promised a lot. None of it costed out. It brings us a new voice in opposition as the NDP will now sit across the aisle. And it brings Ontario its first Green Party MPP. Leader Mike Schreiner made history with his win in Guelph, and it wasn't close. Ontario's first Green MPP, Mike Schreiner, joins us on the Unpublished Cafe. And Mike, first off, congratulations. And you mentioned momentum that was behind you in Guelph. What do you think drove that?
Well, Ed, first of all, it's a pleasure being on, and I appreciate the kind congratulations. I think that what drove the momentum were really three things. So one was I've worked really hard in Guelph for a long time and been a real champion for the community, and have been involved in a number of community organizations, volunteer boards, things like that. And so I think people here in Guelph just sort of see me as an active, engaged citizen who, as my role as Green Party leader, applied that on a number of issues that are really important to people in Guelph. I think the second reason is that this was an election about change. And so clearly, given the shift we've seen in terms of, who's going to form government, who's the official opposition, the collapse of the Liberal vote, voters wanted something different. And in Guelph, those voters decided that the change they wanted was what the Green Party was offering. And that leads me to my third point, which is I think the way we conducted our campaign and the message we delivered around doing politics differently really resonated here in Guelph. People really like the fact that I ran a positive campaign. I talked about doing politics different. And what I meant by that was that, we weren't going to spend our time tearing other parties down. We saw that a lot, particularly in the leaders' debates. We talked about how the Green Party would build Guelph up, how we would build Ontario up. We were very honest with people. We said, this is what we want to do, this is how we want to do it, and this is how we want to pay for it. And I think that resonated strongly with voters here, which was one of the reasons I had such a significant and resounding election victory. And I think once voters see me in action at Queen's Park and hear that same message across the province, we're going to continue to elect Greens moving forward. And you got a seat without a seat at the leaders' debate. Exactly. If you look at past Greens that have been elected across the country, the Green leader was in the leaders' debate. And so I think this is the first time that you've seen a Green elected now who was not part of the leaders' debate. And so that was certainly a significant hurdle we had to overcome. But we had a fantastic team here in Guelph that really pulled it off. What does your win mean for the Green movement in Canada? Well, I think it's pretty significant because people have said to me, okay, it's great. Greens have elected people on the coast, in British Columbia and PEI and New Brunswick. But can Greens really get elected in the heart of the country, in the largest, most populous province in the country, and really we're in the heart of where the establishment is in Ontario in many respects. And so the fact that we made a breakthrough in Ontario, I think, is significant. Mike Schreiner is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He is the Ontario Green Party leader and the first Green Party MPP to go to Queen's Park. Now, the win is key, Mike. What is the job ahead of you? Well, I think, first of all, I'm focusing on setting up a very strong constituency office, making sure that, I play that important role that an MPP plays in serving the community. I think one of the things I want to do that may be a little unique is use my office as just sort of a citizen engagement hub to help people, organize around issues that they care about, create space for community conversations about how do we make Guelph better, how do we make Ontario better. Obviously, I'm working through my legislative strategy of how we can be most effective at Queen's Park and just effective across the province in delivering our key objectives. And, I talked a lot in the campaign about how do we create jobs that put people and planet first? How do we leap into the future and embrace the global clean economy and make Ontario a leader? And in my case, make Guelph and Ontario a leader. and then take the prosperity and in a fiscally responsible way, invest that in good public services like expanding healthcare, improving education, making sure everyone has a place they can afford to call home, and then obviously protecting the people and places we love, especially looking at, not only protecting the existing green belt, but expanding it in southern Ontario to include the blue belt across the province, protecting farmland and source water regions. And I'm looking at how I can go to Queen's Park and reach across the aisle and work cooperatively with other parties where we can find areas of common ground and just really get away from this adversarial politics that, I'm always right, you're always wrong. Let's just criticize the other parties instead of actually find areas of common ground. That being said, obviously there will be areas of confrontation. I already, sent out a pretty strongly worded statement today in response to Mr. Ford announcing that one of his first acts is going to be to completely dismantle the province's climate action plan and the cap and trade system in an irresponsible way. So, I will look at ways to be cooperatively and work across party lines. And then, there will be times that confrontation will be in order and I'll criticize the government.
Now, you mentioned pulling out of cap and trade in an irresponsible way. Is there a responsible way?
Well, I think the Green Party's plan is the responsible way. We said that we would phase out of cap and trade because I agree the Liberal plan isn't the most effective way to price pollution. But I think pulling out of it immediately without any alternative plan is irresponsible. I think it's bad for business. It sends the wrong signal to clean economy companies around the world. It's almost telling them, oh, well, Ontario is not open for business, in the area where we're seeing global job growth. And so our plan to do a 5-year phase out of cap and trade and replace it with a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend program where you put a price on pollution and all the money that's raised from that would go back to the people of Ontario to help them navigate the transition to a low carbon economy.
Your win is historic, but you're still just one vote. How do you plan on making your voice heard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been asked that question a lot. And, I look at what other Green MLAs are doing across the country. David Kuhn in New Brunswick was able to pass 4 pretty significant pieces of legislation as private members' bills because he approached it in ways of how do I work with other parties instead of just, criticize other parties. Peter Bevan Baker's done the same in PEI. And because of that, he's been able to double their caucus. And now the PEI Greens are pulling neck and neck with the governing Liberals. And it looks like, they could form official opposition or even possibly form government after the next election, if you can believe the poll numbers. And then obviously, Andrew Weaver in British Columbia has taken that exact same approach and tripled their caucus now, and they hold the balance of responsibility in a minority government. So one Green MPP can make a huge difference at Queen's Park. And, I plan on learning from the lessons that other Green leaders of how they've made a difference, and I will apply that in Ontario.
You talk about just one MPP, one Green Party MPP, but after the election, we were hearing that the Liberals wanted you to join them.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Liberals wanted me to join them, but I want to be very clear with your listeners that I have no desire to join the Liberals. Matter of fact, if they want to come join the Green Party, we'd be interested in them considering that, though we'd have to vet them first just to make sure they, meet our values and subscribe to Green Party values. But my goal here is that I'm going to go to Queen's Park as an elected Green MPP, a strong voice for Guelph, a strong voice for changing the way politics is done in Ontario. And I think as one Green MPP, I can make a big difference.
Mike, I wish you all the best at Queen's Park and congratulations on the win.
Hey, Ed, it's my pleasure and always happy to be on your show.
Mike Schreiner is the leader of the Ontario Green Party and becomes the party's first ever MPP in Ontario. So we're looking at a PC majority for the next 4 years after 15 of sitting in opposition. We have the province's first Green member of the Ontario legislature. Now to gaze ahead in the province and see where we're going and how Doug Ford's win will affect change in Canada, Caroline Andrew is the director of the Centre on Governance at the University of Ottawa, and she joins us today. Now, Caroline, the Ontario election reminded me a bit of that federal election back in 1992 is thought that PC's decimated. Other than the numbers, do you see any other similarities?
Well, I think there are some similarities in that elections like that are always about the kind of support that the winners get, largely because of things that people dislike about other governments, other priorities. And I think it's exactly the same this time. The really mass support for the new Ontario government is really that they hate the federal government priorities. They hate spending money on daycare. They hate spending money on social housing. They don't much like immigration, and they really hate feminism. They also hate the provincial parties. Wynne was particularly hated. I have a daughter who listens to social media, and she says she has never heard or seen more disgusting remarks, largely about Wynne being a lesbian and a woman, but largely about anti-lesbianism. So they hate Wynne with a fervor. They hate the NDP because there again it's spending on social housing and daycare, and people just don't understand that it's very hard to convince people that if you're on below the average income, you're better to pay taxes and get services, but nobody gets that. People don't get that. Governments don't get that. So I think there's this mass support for the new government, but the weaknesses, which are many, and I'll get on to the priorities, but the weaknesses are that they're not going to be able to deliver.
You know, have you seen an election campaign like this where the managing editor of a major newspaper, and in this case it was the Toronto Sun, issuing a memo calling for all writers and columnists to slant their coverage? I don't think I've ever seen that before. No, I think it was the night of the election, the coverage was pretty feeble. I don't know that we've got the research capacity. I thought the coverage was pretty, it was all about which riding was going which way, but it wasn't about what's happening to the economy of North America, et cetera. I thought that was pretty disappointing because I think that the priorities of the government, he wants to cut taxes, but there's no money, so that's going to be difficult. He says he'll find millions of cash or millions of expenditures of the government, but we've heard that before. Remember good old Mike Harris and the Common Sense Revolution. We know that there aren't millions. And they'll try and pretend they find millions, but they won't. So they won't be able to go on to their priorities. The problem with jobs is that we're losing jobs, and we're particularly losing working class jobs, and that's his supporters. They're not the people so I think he's going to have real trouble with the whole what's happening with all the discussions with Trump and with the discussions about who's going to tax what. I think we're losing some of and we already see it. We're losing some of the jobs that we had, and so I think that he's going to find it very difficult to deliver on jobs, and that was the overriding thing on the night of the election: jobs for everyone, a job for everyone who wants to work, which again is just not going to be. So I think we're going to be into he'll have a certain part of the first year or so where he's still going to have all the support, and
the supporters who think that he can do what he said he would do. And then I think we're going to begin to see both we'll see what happens to the Liberals and whether they can start to rebuild. It won't be for the next election, that's clear, but it might be for one after that. And I think we'll begin to see we'll find out from what's going to happen at the federal level, because I think Ontario always sees itself as sort of really Canada. They think that they're the economy, which they are, of course, the big economy. But I think we'll begin to see that they start thinking about what's happening in Ontario and not so much just being beside themselves with what they think is going on at the federal level. So I think there will be a period of fairly possibilities for Ford to do what he said he would do. But as I say, I don't think there's any. And of course, the things these people don't like are also the things that they need. Most of these, everyone the aging of the Ontario population means that even people who don't like spending on social housing actually want their parents to be able to get into decent retirement homes, decent places for what they need medically, decent. So that's very contradictory and ambiguous, because they actually do want they think they don't want public housing because they think that public housing is for the no-goods, but they actually do desperately want their elderly parents, who are going to have more and more complications, needing decent accommodation and needing people who want to work with them. And so they do actually want immigrant workers, but they don't think they do because they have prejudicial views. So I think it's going to be I think there's going to be a whole discussion after about a year or two as to whether they really do want what they say they don't want, and they really do want to. They say they don't like paying taxes, but they really want there to be taxes to support these public services that we're going to need. We're to support a cliche. We're an aging population. We don't have children, so we do need more people to look after our aging population, and that's a dynamic that isn't going to change. But I think it won't change quickly in Ontario because there is this mass support for some of the understandable worries of lower middle class people who, especially in Toronto suburbs, are having a terrible time paying their mortgages, losing housing, but also I think we're going to maybe see, I hope anyways, a lessening of the kind of Trump echo about not having sex education, not having hating lesbianism, and encore worse about different forms of gender identity. But I think that may diminish a bit. It'll depend on what happens in part in the U.S. But so I think we'll have a couple of years where the government will have a liberty to try and put into place what it says it wanted to do, but I think there are just structural issues that are going to make that extremely difficult, particularly for the kind of population who voted for Ford.
Caroline Andrew is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. She's the director of the Centre on Governance at the University of Ottawa as we look back at the Ontario election. And we'll just shift away from Doug Ford for a second. The NDP are now in opposition, and it is a move up for them, but it also seems like it was a missed opportunity as they polled well, but they couldn't turn that into seats.
Yeah, and I don't know whether that's I don't know whether it was that they didn't have the troops on the ground and weren't able to turn it into seats. They kept their sort of more traditional bases, but I think there'll probably be a fairly public discussion in the NDP as to what went wrong. I think there'll be, not for a while, but I think there'll start to be a discussion about whether Horwath is the right person to continue to lead the party. She certainly did well in the beginning of the campaign, but I think people will start to question as to whether she's the right person, and of course that always creates conflict in the party and discussions on what are the issues and between the kind of environmental left and the kind of trade union left. I think there'll be some sort of boiling up of discussion. Not, of course, as much as there will be in what remains of the Liberal Party, which is going to have a huge discussion as to there's a temporary leader, but what do you do? What do you build on? Is there?
Well, after 15 years, was it just they were way past the best before date? Or did all those little things start piling up and piling up?
Yeah, I think it was the piling up. I mean, there were things that was McGuinty passed on an enormous bundle of trouble.
Yeah.
And I think that just kept growing and growing. And then there was really a personal, I would almost use the word hatred, listening to what my daughter listened to on social media, a really hatred of Wynne. And so the combination, but I think it was more, they've had a long term and you just accumulate people who are irritated by the government for some, perhaps good ideas, but terribly badly done, and other ideas that are probably not that good, and some ideas that are good, but the electorate isn't perhaps quite ready for it. So I think they're going to be a while in just figuring out what, and so I think they'll be quite quiet for several years. And I think you're right that it's just the accumulation after about 30 years, governments just develop so many people irritated by this and that it's very difficult to. And when it becomes focused on some leader, it becomes a reason to lose the election. A bit like, if you want, like Harper at the federal level. I mean, he won several elections, but at a certain pace, the accumulated irritation of people for all kinds of things just made him the sort of figure of vast irritation of enough of the electorate that you got the result you got.
What does a seat, the breakthrough for the Green Party, mean for them?
I think that's interesting, and I think that it'll be very interesting to see how they can play on it, because I think we've seen in the West the Greens, and sometimes again the Greens get into difficult defining what are their principal, how they should move forward on what specific event. But it's clear that the environment is a huge concern, and I think it's interesting to see how they're going to be able to keep the environmental, perhaps making clear that there's also an economic argument, both in better agricultural ways, and I think it's interesting the connections that are sort of being made between environmentalism, the interest in in healthy food, and sort of moving the environmental issue into something that touches people at a variety of levels. It's not only it is about the planet, but it is also about where you get your decent food in various communities. So it's about plastic recycling. So I think there is a possibility. I think it needs a base who can keep talking about all of these issues and trying to keep them together rather than separate them out. But they certainly always have it'll be very challenging for the person here to try and keep it as a broad sphere of issues rather than but of course that's always difficult because you're always having to battle in the legislature on one specific bill. So I think it's going to be a challenge, especially for one person, to be able to keep that broad vision and keep the coalition of the different, really quite different kinds of groups who find themselves in the Green Party.
What does Doug Ford, as Premier of Ontario, mean for Prime Minister Trudeau, who is looking at an election next year?
I think it will mean it will be a huge issue. I think for Trudeau and the Liberals is how they can keep their focus on. Perhaps it's going to mean trying to make a greater demonstration of fiscal. Well, not prudence, but better explaining of government financing, because there is going to be and in a sense it fits with the government's economic agenda. They're not going to be able to make the promises, the sort of big promises, but at the same time, I think it could probably mean that they should focus on explaining how things like daycare and public housing are going to enter in, how they're going to do the right kind of governance to be from the center on governance, but how they're going to connect the private sector, the public sector, the non-for-profit sector to do some of these big issues that people want. The same thing with daycare. How do you do daycare that's both offered directly by the government, community-run daycare, different ways of keeping those coalitions together, which involves reaching out to the private sector, but also keeping the connections to the community sector, including, I think, a role for the cities, a much more important role for the cities, partly because that will emphasize the importance of urban issues, but also it de-emphasizes a sort of a fight between province and federal. It involves this whole new set of actors who are in fact in charge of the economic destinies of the vast majority of the Canadian population. If you add up all the big cities, you really have most of Canada. And so I think that it will probably mean showing an ability to work with the provinces, but also with the municipalities, and getting which will be a complicated question for the provinces who don't always like the federal government dealing with the municipalities. On the other hand, the big issues of the big issues, urban transportation, affordable housing, childcare, are all intimately questions that engage, yes, the provinces, but also the federal government, but increasingly the big cities. And I think it may push a little bit of discussion, not much, but a little, about how you reorganize the governance structures of Canadian federalism so as to at least recognize that as a very urban nation, we need to have some way of connecting those big cities with the provinces and the federal government in a more cooperative relationship. So that's my hope.
Yeah, we can always hope. Caroline, I want to thank you for joining us.
Not at all. A real pleasure.
I want to thank Caroline Andrew for joining us. She's director of the Centre on Governance at the University of Ottawa. I'd also like to thank Green Party leader Mike Schreiner for joining us to talk about his historic win to put him in the legislature, as well Ian Holliday of the Angus Reid Institute, who helped break down how the PCs rolled to a 76-seat majority in Ontario. Thanks for listening to the Unpublished Cafe for Unpublished Ottawa. I'm Ed Hand.